We all know the benefits of worms in the garden. They help soil aeration, water retention, and they help feed the microorganisms in the garden that help plants themselves fix their micronutrients. And they do that through their worm castings. So why is it I don't use worm castings in my garden? Well, there's actually a couple of reasons for that. Gardeners can get worm castings into their soil in a couple of different ways. One, they can buy the bags of worm castings at the store, or they can do vermicomposting. Take kitchen scraps, throw it in a bin, put some worms in there, and have worm castings come out the other end. So it's not like it's particularly difficult to have worm castings in the garden. And yet, there's some problems too. In no particular order, these are some of the reasons why I don't use worm castings in my garden. First, doing a worm bin isn't difficult, but it's a bit of a pain in the neck. The constant maintenance, feeding, and care for the worms can take up a lot of time. Far less than your vegetables and certainly your pets. Worms really aren't a high maintenance item. So you gotta make sure that they have a regular supply of food, that it stays moist, so that you can harvest the castings at the end. But it's a long process. You're not going to get worm castings right away. Once you establish a colony, things can get going pretty good, but it's still going to take a lot of time. And you can't overload a bin with food. Throwing some kitchen scraps in there, I mean, unless you have a really large bin, which I don't think most people do, you really can't overload it with food. So you're not going to get a very large volume of worm castings. You will get some, and those are good, but it's not like you're going to be getting like a 50-pound bag of worm castings out of the typical home vermicomposting system. Buying it from the store, you can get a big bag, but it's not going to be cheap. Worm castings are expensive. Perhaps the most important reason that I don't use worm castings in my garden, the fact is you actually need a lot of worm castings, relatively speaking, to make a difference in the garden. A lot of times you'll see people sprinkling the worm castings over the soil. And again, you're not hurting the soil by doing that, but you're really not giving the soil the benefit that you think you are. According to worm farms, you need at least an inch of worm castings added to the soil. Now, if you've got just a few buckets of vegetables you're growing, you've got a real small, say a 4x4 square of garden, getting a bag of worm castings, adding it to that, you'll gain benefit from that. But if you've got a garden, the amount of size that we have, adding that volume of worm castings to all the beds is going to be prohibitively costly. I prefer to compost using both my chickens and in a composting system, and then feeding the soil, at which will then attract worms to the garden beds and letting them leave their castings in the soil that way. For me, the time, energy, and cost potentially of vermicomposting to harvest worm castings just isn't worth it for me. Again, you're not going to hurt anything by doing that, and you're certainly going to be adding something to the soil through a home vermicomposting system. But it's not as big of a benefit as many people, I think, believe. A few sprinklings of worm castings over your garden beds isn't going to provide the benefits, as I said. So if you've got a very small garden, be growing in buckets, say on a balcony, even in your backyard. If you don't have a lot of space for gardening, worm castings actually can benefit because you don't need all that much. But for any garden of size, adding worm castings to the garden isn't going to be beneficial. So ultimately, I think it comes down to time, volume, and money. The time involved to harvest your own worm castings, it's just too long for me. I think there are other better ways of turning waste into usable material for the garden that will benefit the garden than doing it through vermicomposting. I don't think you get enough from the typical vermicomposting system to make a difference in the garden, and to purchase it from a store, the volume that you would need for the garden is just prohibitive. So let me know what you think in the comments. Do you use worm castings in the garden? And how much do you use? And do you find the time versus cost versus volume worth it for you? And if you want to see what we were doing in the garden last week, check out this video right here. And then subscribe and hit that notification bell. And that way you'll be able to follow along on the progress on all of our vegetables as we try to grow a supermarket in our own backyard. Okay, thanks for watching.